Good evening, good evening, good evening. My name's Frank Dobson, and I'm faculty head of Gillette House here in the Commons at Vanderbilt University. And this program is co-sponsored by several of the houses. My colleagues, Professor Sharon Shields of Murray House, Professor Paul Lim of Crawford, Professor Mark Dalhouse of East House. And I don't think we could do any of this without Dr. Frank Weislow, Dean of the Commons. And so I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. We have two very prominent speakers who are going to be introduced by our students. And I'd like to thank both of them for coming, Stephen Mansfield and Jim Hudnut-Beumler, Dean of the Divinity School. And I'd like to also thank Melinda Scruggs-Gales for her work with this. The great author, James Baldwin, wrote something in a story I want to share with you. The title of the story is This Morning, This Evening, So Soon. What I'm going to read to you is spoken by one of his characters, a black expatriate who happens to be in an interracial relationship. This is what the character is thinking, actually. For everyone's life begins at a level where races, armies, and churches stop. And yet everyone's life is always shaped by races, churches, and armies. Races, churches, and armies menace and have taken many lives. Races, churches, and armies, race, religion, and politics affect our lives in myriad ways. As an undergraduate many years ago, not unlike many of you in the audience, I wondered how the university would affect my faith. I imagine some of you have similar feelings. We hear terms such as the Christian right. Is there a Christian left? And if so, is it only inhabited by people like me, black or minority Christians? James Baldwin once said something that stuck with me over the decades. He once said that the most segregated hour in America is high noon on Sunday morning. Is that still true decades later? What about non-Christians, members of other faiths? Is Barack Obama a closet Muslim? Can I vote for him and still be a Christian given his stance on controversial issues? There are numerous issues about races and armies and churches in this election and post this election. And we are delighted that we can address some of them in this forum. Thank you all for coming out today. We're also delighted that some of our student leaders from the Commons will be involved with this discussion. Harry Stimmel from East House, who's the House Council President, will be introducing Dean Hudnut-Beumler. David Curran, who's the House Council President for Gillette, will be introducing Stephen Mansfield. And in addition to Paul Lim, Professor Lim serving as moderator, Yusuf Ahmad, the House Council President of Murray, will be moderating. And so I'd like to turn it over to David Curran.
Hello, I'm David Curran. I'm House President of Gillette House. I work with Dr. Dobson and have the privilege of introducing Stephen Mansfield tonight. Stephen Mansfield is a popular speaker, a New York Times bestselling author, leader, and advisor whose work is centered on faith, character, and leadership in the service of society. He is gaining an international reputation as a popular speaker of both depth and insight into our changing culture, yet this reputation has been fueled by his award-winning career as an author. He has written books on a wide variety of topics, such as The Character of Winston Churchill, The Faith of George W. Bush, The Challenges of the American Soldier, The Wisdom of Booker T. Washington, The Direction of the New Pope, and the separation between church and state in America. His work has taken him from the Vatican to the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq, and from the White House to the poorest neighborhoods of America. Mansfield is best known, perhaps, for his book, The Faith of George W. Bush, which was released in 2003 and which spent 14 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list. Mansfield's latest work, The Faith of Barack Obama, presents an objective look at Obama's religious life and the controversies that have surrounded it. Mansfield resides in downtown Nashville with his wife, Beverly, who is a successful songwriter and producer. Next, Harry's going to introduce Dr. James Hudnut-Beumler.
Harry Stimmel. I'm the president of East House. I'm also here with my freshman writing seminar on presidential politics, also taught by Professor Dr. Dahlhaus. I'm introducing Dr. James Hudnut-Beumler. He's the dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School and Ann Potter Wilson Distinguished Professor of American Religious History. He's a graduate of the College of Worcester and Princeton University and has been on faculty at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University, Columbia Theological Seminary, and here at Vanderbilt Divinity School since 2000. He's authored 2 other books before writing his most recent book called In Pursuit of the Almighty's Dollar, A History of Money in American Protestantism, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2007. Dean Hudnut-Beumler has a longstanding interest in the intersections of religion, politics, race, and identity. Thus, he would be an ideal conversation partner for Dr. Mansfield tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dean Hudnut-Beumler.
Thank you, Harry. For how many of you in this room will this be your first vote for president? Wow. You've got a great. This is a great and momentous choice, a wonderful election to come of age, politically speaking. Why? Because race, religion, politics, all of it is very live. I'm going to talk about religion and the American presidency and put that in historical context, first of all, then look at the 4 people who might end up being president as a result of our elections coming up in a month, and then look at us as voters who instantiate race and religion and bring that into the polls with us and to public opinion polls and other things. For as it turns out, it isn't the mere fact of being a certain race or a certain religion that determines what happens in American political life and the presidency. It's a matter of who you interact with, what they put before you, what kind of events come before you, and what you make of those things as a leader in response to events. You know, we supposedly, we've had a strange year here. We began with a whole bunch of would-be candidates representing the far reaches of sort of religious sentiment in this country. You know, from Tom Tancredo, kind of on the right, to Ron Paul, you know, a former Lutheran who is absolutely secular in his outlook, to 3 leading Democrats, Edwards, Clinton, and Obama, who actually could answer questions about their prayer life and what it meant to them. You know, who would have guessed that we would have so quickly become a country where religion mattered in the midst of this year very much gender mattering and race mattering, and I should add, generation or chronological age mattering. These things have always been in the mix, but you only get one president every 4 years, and sometimes from the very beginning, every 8 years. We supposedly live in a country where there is no religious test for office, but our presidents are constantly religiously tested. What do you think, Mr. President, of this, that, and the other thing? And in his farewell address, our first president, George Washington, advised his fellow citizens that religion and morality were the great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. National morality, he added, could not exist in exclusion of religious principle. Virtue or morality, he concluded, as the products of religion, were a necessary spring of popular government. So, from the very beginning, there is no religious test, but we expect our presidents to, first of all, be virtuous people, and as a mostly religious people, we expect to find our virtue in reflected in their having faith-friendly positions. You know, the great question in American religious history when it comes to politics is could an atheist get elected in this country as president? And the cocktail chatter is no. Thomas Jefferson gave us this great metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state, but it didn't stop him from in the White House cutting up two Bibles to make a better version of the sayings of Jesus. Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural, acted as a kind of pastor and theologian in chief when he tried to place the entire Civil War, then almost 4 years in theological context. He said, neither party, North or the South, expected for the war the magnitude or duration which it has already attained. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. That's a slap at slavery. But let us not judge that we be not judged. The Almighty has his own purposes. So right there in the middle of an inaugural address, public speech, we have public religion. Ronald Reagan knew what he was doing. Indeed, one of his finest moments, in my opinion, was when he went on the night that the Challenger space shuttle blew up, and all of American school children nearly were watching this because a teacher was going into space. And the president comes on at 8 o'clock Eastern and addresses the nation almost as a minister might, or a rabbi. The crew of the space shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and then they slipped the surly bounds of earth to touch the face of God. More recently, Bill Clinton upstaged a minister, a priest, and a rabbi at the Oklahoma City Memorial. You know, they kept not wanting to say the God word too often or anything like that. He quotes two scriptures from the Hebrew Bible and one from the Christian scriptures, and delivers a kind of healing words. I'll just quote briefly from that. He says, my fellow Americans, a tree takes a long time to grow, and wounds take a long time to heal, but we must begin. Those who are lost now belong to God. Someday we will be with them. But until that happens, their legacy must be our lives. So again, he's using that religion and turning what is a very angry moment towards a constructive difference. So religion is both something that presidents will go back to and something that they may actually draw on. It's not merely bunk or some kind of cover to get people to vote for them. It is what we expect them to do. Not everybody's that profound. Here's George Bush. He was asked who was his favorite philosopher in one of the debates, and he just said, Jesus Christ. And there it stood. What do you say to that? But indeed, that reflected a certain kind of, well, Stephen is better able to talk about that. I would say that Bush has operated out of a theopoetics of good versus evil. He lives in a very kind of Manichaean world where there are good evil doers and there are good people. And he'll say something like this after 9/11. Make no mistake about it. This is good versus evil. These are evildoers. They have no justification for their actions. There's no religious justification. There's no political justification. The only motivation is evil. So whomever we elect with those kinds of religious views that they may have, those views will find a way out. And we'll skip over Kennedy and Kerry and go right to the folks we have running this year. Who do we have in this year's candidates? What are their views? How might they come forth? Well, it's less clear than it might be, given the fact that there are two dominant issues, the economy and the war. So we don't know as much about how things go, but at least two of the candidates are pretty colorful. Barack Obama has had what first appeared to be a conventional mainline Protestant association with the United Church of Christ. They kept saying this again and again. And nobody who'd been to Trinity UCC thought it was all that conventional. It turned out that under Pastor Wright, it was an Afrocentric church with a strong critique of white dominance and privilege, and worked out of a framework of liberation theology. Still, the more we got to hear from the Obamas, the more they seemed somewhat to the moderate side of all of that. And we also learned that here they are, Generation Xers, people who don't need to be religious in the conventional way. In their generation, it is not just assumed that you'll belong to a standard brand church, to be Catholic or to belong to a synagogue or declare that you're Episcopalian and go occasionally. That's true in Biden's generation. That's true in McCain's. Obama, who is not raised this way, ends up choosing Trinity UCC, is formed by his pastor. And when the Obamas spoke, really first when we heard Barack Obama give the race speech after the Reverend Wright debacle, if you will, where he really comes out and gives what evangelicals would recognize as testimony about his life and about his moral formation. It's interesting. Michelle Obama does the same thing at the convention. Any sort of Protestant churchgoers of the more evangelical stripe would recognize what she said about herself as telling her story. She gave a witness to who she was and by extension to her husband. Okay, that's the Obamas. And what's interesting to me about that is that they're much more comfortable with themselves qua religious people than, say, Al Gore and John Kerry could ever hope to be. Joe Biden, as I mentioned, is from a different generation. He's Catholic, and for him, faith is like family, like love of country, like school, like church, like growing up in Scranton. There is a kind of wholeness to that identity that he nevertheless has developed a certain amount of distance from, like a lot of Roman Catholics of his generation. That is, he doesn't agree with all of the church's teachings on things like abortion and birth control, nor does he apply that to his voting record. And if this were a different election where those kind of issues mattered more, he could have been a real liability. On the plus side, a lot of what he brings to the table in terms of foreign policy experience and the way he talks about that is clearly recognizable as the product of good Catholic moral theology education. John McCain. McCain exemplifies the best in a kind of loyal West Point man who even belonged to a church with red, white, and blue colors, the Episcopal Church. He claims more recent affiliation with a Baptist church, but as we saw, his heart really wasn't in it when his pastor sought to offer standard fair religious right prescriptions in the spring. So there, both of these candidates had to distance themselves, and that created the very sorts of problems with part of the Republican Party base that then the Palin choice was supposed to ameliorate. Now, so let's then consider Sarah Palin. With Sarah Palin, we get a new sort of conventional American religious story. She's been a lot of different things, and there are a lot of us like that. She was born into the Catholic Church and baptized into the Catholic Church. As a teenager, she began going to an Assemblies of God Pentecostal church in her hometown and asked to be rebaptized out of a belief that the first one really didn't matter because it wasn't a believer's baptism. She led a high school chapter of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Since a falling out in 2002, she's been associated with 4 other churches. And when she's asked, well, what kind of Christian are you? She says, Christian. He says, just Christian? She says, Bible-believing Christian. So, I mean, this is not, it sounds like it's a position of ignorance. Actually, it's a position that a lot of evangelicals of her generation would adopt. Names aren't important anymore. We're post-denominational. So this is an election of lots of different religious cohorts, lots of different kinds of people from different parts of the country and world, and yet, sorry, and oh no, the final thing, this didn't come up earlier. The final thing I want to talk about is that who they are and what they bring to the table is only part of it. because for decades, political scientists have been trying to figure out who's going to win based on who's running and who the people are and how they'll vote. You know, like it used to be 1890 that Protestants in the Midwest would vote Republican, and Catholics in the cities would vote with the Democratic machine. That broke down a long time ago, but they've been trying refinements and refinements and refinements. And it was thought in the 2000 election you could explain it that if you went to church more than once a month, you would vote for Bush. And if you've ever saw a pornographic movie, you voted for Gore. You know, that was the great moral divide, and we only needed to ask 2 questions to know how things would come out. They tried that in 2004. It didn't predict the carry thing as well. What a really smart guy named John Green has put together is what he calls the 12 tribes analysis. And I'll leave you with this. He argues that there are 12 tribes of American religious affiliation or lack thereof. And if you really want to think about who lines up with who from a voting block, you need to think of these as tribal groups. The first is the religious right. You know, the people who are really excited about Huckabee and now are excited to some degree about Palin. There are heartland culture warriors. You know, they like Fred Thompson. There are moderate evangelicals. What's interesting about this is, are the Obama's going to get any of those people? I think maybe so. There are white bread Protestants. You know, people like John Edwards and George H.W. Bush fit into this. And Hillary Clinton, people who belong to the United Methodist Church or the Presbyterian Church. They're convertible Catholics. These are people who affiliate with the church, still call themselves Catholic, but don't do all they think for themselves politically over against the Vatican and the ordinary magisterium of the church. There's the religious left. There is a religious left. They go to Unitarian churches and UCC churches and Unity churches and some Presbyterian, some Episcopal churches, some Methodist churches, so forth. How will they come? The Quakers. They're spiritual but not religious. You know, this is the people who buy a lot of books in a certain section of Borders or Barnes and Nobles, but don't actually go to church. But that doesn't mean they aren't thinking about it. There are Latinos who deserve to be regarded as a distinct tribe who may have been normally attracted towards Republican politics and family-oriented sorts of policies, who've been scared to death by immigration this year. They're Jews as a group. There are Muslims who are now as numerous as voters as Jews in the United States. And there are black Protestants who are, have been a significant factor in this election, and we'll see what goes on. And with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen, and we'll go from there.
Just take. All right, that's great. Good evening. How you doing? Good. I'm so glad that this is being done. So glad that we're talking about this, because I think that we're living at a time when greater sophistication about faith is absolutely essential, and I'm proud of the Commons for putting this together and for that approach to education. I also am very glad to be here because just standing next to the dean, my IQ has gone up about 7 or 8 points, and so that's good for me. I'm going to try to make that a regular experience. What we apparently are not questioning this evening is whether religious faith matters in a political candidate. Apparently, we're not asking that question, and I think that that's something we probably can bring back in Q&A. I will tell you that my greatest concern about any candidate or any president in politics in my lifetime was when Ronald Reagan was sitting in the Oval Office wondering about Armageddon and what his role might be in it. And I'm a conservative. You understand what I'm saying? So when Ronald Reagan, when presidents go to the Oval Office and they ponder great theological themes, sometimes beyond their IQ, you know, you begin to be concerned. And I think that in an age in which I knew what kind of underwear Bill Clinton wore, and later on what was, you know, what the configuration of his private parts were, I certainly think it's okay for me to know what he believes and how it might shape how he handles the poor or immigration or something else about his life. So that seems to be, I just want to mark that for us this evening. It seems to be kind of a consensus that we're coming to in our society. That's a shift, as the dean shared with us earlier. It's a shift in that we are now accepting the view that it is important, that a candidate's faith is important. This is a decided shift, for example, as Howard Dean would indicate. When Howard Dean was running for president, he said to his staff, "Don't talk about God, guns, and gays." He went on the 700 Club with Pat Robertson and encouraged Pat by saying that Democrats really had a lot in common with Christians, as though there were no Christian Democrats. Do you know what I mean? In other words, he saw this in sort of a cavernous, you know, not a cavernous, but some great chasm between the two. So that's the old school view, and now that's changing. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. I want to go short because I'm more interested in your questions, and you've had a brilliant opening here with the dean's talk. But let me give you a little bit more, maybe my perspective on what's shifting, what have been the shifts in this election, what's defining this election so much. One of the things that's happening that is absolutely essential for us to understand is that there is a dramatic change in the role of what we've been calling the religious right. In this election, there's no question that the religious right has lost its national presence to a large extent and has, in my opinion, gone grassroots. Think about it. If you've been thinking about politics for some years, you know that it wasn't that long ago that Jerry Falwell was an influence and D. James Kennedy was an influence. Both men are dead now. It wasn't that long ago that Pat Robertson would have been a huge influence, but he's been, what shall we say, sort of sidelined by his own, frankly, ignorant statements. Then you have Ted Haggard, who would have been a major player as the president of the National Association of Evangelicals some years ago, who is now sidelined through his own personal immorality. Most of the clergymen who are prominent on the national stage, Joel Osteen, T.D. Jakes, people of that kind, are not very political. Even Rick Warren is playing a role in social issues, but is not siding with anyone in terms of his position politically. The Faith Forum, I think, beautiful job of remaining objective. So the religious right, the hardcore religious right that arose really with Washington for Jesus in 1980, kind of got stirred a bit 1976 with the rise of Jimmy Carter talking about being a born-again politician, that has lost its national leadership. And there's really only one man left, and I'll come back and talk to you about him and how many evangelicals tend to see him today. So that's one trend, the religious right, that hard kind of right-wing merging of faith and politics is not dead, but has definitely lost its clear national voice as of this election. You know, when they turn to somebody for faith and religion, they tend to turn to Jim Wallace, who certainly, a friend of mine, but certainly not a man on the hard right. The second trend that's happening, and the dean pointed it out, is that the quote-unquote religious left is finding its voice in this election. Now, that's a little bit of an odd thing to say because the religious left has existed, you know, for decades, if not for centuries. It's probably fair to say that Martin Luther King Jr. was you know, on the religious left, and the clergy who assisted in the rise of the labor movement were on the religious left. I could go on the Catholic worker movement. We could go on and on and on. But in recent decades, what you had from most politicians on the left was kind of a self-imposed separation of religion and government. In other words, Jimmy Carter would say, "I'm personally born again, but I will engage and execute democratic values in the Oval Office. He never made the case that he was going to take his born-again Christianity into the Oval Office. I would say that Bill Clinton probably was very much on that same model. The difference now, and I think Barack Obama is the symbol of this, is that Barack Obama intends to take his left-leaning politics and left-leaning faith into the Oval Office just as surely as George W. Bush intended to take his conservative evangelical Christianity into the Oval Office. I remember, since I confuse people. By the way, I have both seen a porn movie and I go to church once a month, so where do I get to live? I don't understand what I'm supposed to be doing. It gets worse, by the way. My undergraduate works from Oral Roberts University. There's something for us to talk about. I have a master's degree from Pepperdine and from Abilene Christian and a doctorate from a Presbyterian seminary. Now that's schizophrenic right there religiously, I can tell you. So we can talk all about we can parse my psychology later. I think what's interesting here is that Barack Obama has become the symbol of this. And the symbol of this sort of a left-leaning politics religion coming into politics. What I was going to say was, people often don't know who to identify me with. Am I, with Obama? Because I've certainly had people upset with me because I wrote about him. And then am I, a writer on the hard right, part of the vast right-wing conspiracy? And so when George W. Bush was proposing faith-based initiatives, I had my friends on the left calling me saying, well, he's obviously trying to build a theocracy. Well, that worked great until Barack Obama said he intended to continue exactly the same thing, yet on a different theological basis. And so you see, now you have a change where you have some of the same mechanisms being used, but with a different theology, so to speak. And so it's interesting to watch Howard Dean chair the Democratic Party when his candidate is Barack Obama, who is not refusing to talk about God, gays, and guns, but instead is talking about all of them and doing so, and engaging his politics from a faith basis. That's the major shift that's happening in our time. And the third shift that's happening connected to this election, the decline of the religious rights national leadership, the rise of the religious left and its voice, is represented in this room. Again, raise your hand if you'll vote for the first time in this election. Look at this, just for those of you who have come in late. You guys are screwing us up. You guys are confusing to people who try to put everybody into a box, because you are politically active, socially conscious, and you're not the pagans that we were told that you were going to be, okay? We were told you'd be the barbarians that would invade our nice little society, and you're not. You have a faith basis for the most, I'm talking about statistically here, and yet it's relatively non-traditional. My guess would be, and I'm not in any way accusing, love to have this discussion in Q&A, that many of you don't go to a church, but do consider yourselves people of deep faith. Or if you have a spiritual group you identify with, it might be 5 friends over a latte at Starbucks with a copy of Purpose-Driven Life or something like that. That's more what your generation tends to do. And so as you guys come online as voters, you tend to be a bit left-leaning in your politics because you have a social conscience that has not always been the exercise by people of faith. And at the same time, you're still very faith-based in the way that you think about things. You have an integrated, innovative approach. And again, I'm speaking statistically, not so much about the folks in the room. So you're shifting too, and you tend to, again, statistically, as speaking of you in general terms, you tend to identify with Obama, not just because he's innovative and cool and half white and half black, but because that's what people say, is that you guys just get caught up in the cool vibe. No, I think it's more substantive than that. I think the issue is that he is trying an integration of a different faith basis with a social conscience that captures those of you who are pretty much already there anyway as a generation. And you will be a major factor in this election, and I'm not sure anybody's quite figured out what that's going to mean. So those are the 3 trends that I think are dramatically changing the religious landscape in this election. I'm delighted to go back into those in Q&A. I want to focus for a moment on the evangelicals. I don't know how many of you in this room would consider yourself evangelicals. I am an evangelical. I've been through all the 12 steps for it, and I still am. And I believe that one of the things that's happening is that there's a shift in the evangelical world. Evangelicals number about a quarter of the electorate. The Pew 4 would say about a quarter of the American population, but I think that might be a little large. And I think what's happened to a lot of evangelicals is they were drawn into politics with the encouragement of people like D. James Kennedy and Jerry Falwell and many others, Jim Wallace, and a whole spectrum of folks, because they wanted to do good in the world. They really wanted to do good in the world. They wanted to roll back some of the downward slide immorality they saw in the society. They wanted to make the womb the safest place in the country. They wanted to have an effect on curriculum in the public schools. They wanted to do good. They wanted to do good. And then I think that sometime later, they woke up and they'd become the faith basis of the hard right wing in American politics. And I think that was a surprise to a lot of them. I don't think they had intended to get there. And I think what's happening in recent politics is that many of these evangelicals who got into politics to do good, got into politics and began to encourage politics because they cared about public policy issues from a moral perspective, began to rethink their association with the hard right. I call these the new evangelicals, and there's a article that'll be in USA Today this next Monday that I wrote about this very topic. I think that the new evangelical looks at the old evangelical who has been engaged in American politics and is, if not disgusted, a little embarrassed. An example would be James Dobson. Now, James Dobson is the last old lion of the religious right. Again, Falwell and Kennedy and others gone, as I said earlier, people sidelined. And like me, many of these evangelicals are shaped every day as parents and as spouses by the things that Dobson's taught. I'm a better husband and a better father by virtue of being, by virtue of some of what James Dobson has written. But in this election, I come close to being, I think like many evangelicals, embarrassed, really. James Dobson attacks Mr. McCain in the primaries, then attacks viciously Mr. Thompson before Mr. Thompson has even really engaged his campaign. There's an argument that he never actually did engage his campaign, but before he's even gotten up and running. Then we get to the general election, and he attacks Mr. Obama for a 2-year-old speech, and he only endorsed Mr. Huckabee 2 weeks before Mr. Huckabee dropped out of the race, so that didn't do a whole lot of good. And so now he's sort of that old religious right kingmaker sitting in Colorado Springs, trying to decide who he's going to make the sign of the cross over. I may be overstating slightly, but I think that many of us, among what I would call the new evangelicals, look at Dobson and say, look, what we wish you had done is heard Barack Obama's Father's Day sermon and gone to him and said, look, we don't agree about a lot of stuff, but if you want to encourage righteous fathering in America, particularly in the African American community, I'm with you. Let's build something. That's what the new evangelical would like, rather than just casting, just throwing bombs at the man because we're not 100% agreed. So I think there's definitely a shift happening in the evangelical world, and I think that one of the phrases that's sort of coming to the fore is a phrase that comes out of some scholarship on the prophets, and it's the phrase prophetic distance. Evangelicals are starting to realize, slowly, but still starting to realize, that neither party has fallen unblemished from heaven, that there is no party of God in America, and that both parties, in fact, represent platforms that are near to a biblical social mandate, near to the heart of God, if you want to be more devotional about it. Most evangelicals are pro-life. Most evangelicals would want to not have the whole vision for family rewritten by a gay agenda in America. At the same time, most evangelicals we are starting to say, there's a whole lot in the Bible about the poor, far more than there is about gays, far more than there is about a lot of these other things we've been concerned about, far more than there is, by the way, than there is in the Bible about funding Wall Street. You'd be surprised how much there is in the Bible about the poor as opposed to. And so you find issues like that, the taking care of the stranger in the land, for example, very prominent biblical theme, clearly relevant to immigration. Where is that in the Republican Party? Is that even addressed? It seems to be over here on this other side. If all you were trying to do is be biblical, again, which is what most evangelicals in theory are attempting to do, rather than just narrowly political, you would say, wow, that biblical social mandate is spread over both parties. Now we have a decision to make. And so what's happening is that rather than just being the Republican Party at prayer, evangelicals are beginning to distance themselves a bit, maintain a prophetic distance, and speak power to both sides. And I mean, speak to the power on both sides. And I think that this is welcome because I think there's been a blindness amongst evangelicals and an unwillingness to be to come more from their faith than to simply play power politics. And this is why I think James Dobson, and I know I'm being harsh about him tonight, I hope I'm not being offensive, is so, I think, embarrassing at this point, because it's clear that he's the last of the old lions who has been used to playing this kind of kingmaker power politics. And when it's out of season, when it's old and he's the last one trying to do it, then it becomes even more embarrassing. Let's talk about the four candidates real quick. I think that it's one of the reasons that evangelicals are shifting a bit when it comes to the candidates is that until Sarah Palin came on board anyway, evangelicals were somewhat suspicious of John McCain, and there was good reason to be. Not the least of which is that during certain seasons, John McCain hated evangelicals, which tended to distance them a bit. And the reason was several things. First of all, John McCain has particularly eschewed and denied that he's the language of being born again. He doesn't like that language at all. He does come from an Episcopalian background, and by the way, Dean, I hate to correct you, but my West Point family will insist that I tell you that John McCain went to the Naval Academy. My ancestors are rolling over, and please don't claim a swabby for the West Point. Anyway, my ancestors now smile upon me. So John McCain is a man who has been raised in the Christian faith. When he was a POW in Hanoi, his commanders actually made him the sort of the chaplain amongst the POWs, because he'd been Episcopalian and therefore had the Lord's Prayer memorized and had the Apostles' Creed memorized and so on. But later then he got into politics. I think that genuinely he was offended by the hardball politics of the religious right. And I think one of the most painful incidents for him was during the 2004 campaign, when during the South Carolina primary, people, and McCain believes it was Falwell and Robertson. There's no evidence of that I know, but that's what he believed at the time. People were saying that his dark-skinned daughter was the result of an affair, because they apparently didn't know or didn't want to acknowledge publicly that he and his wife had actually adopted her from Mother Teresa's orphanage in Bangalore. And so she was dark-skinned. She wasn't the product of an affair, but this was brought up in South Carolina for obvious racial reasons to discredit him, and that's when he called them agents of intolerance. So he's had a hard time with them, and I think what causes the evangelicals to distance themselves a bit is not just that, but also that he seems a little squishy on the abortion issue. I mean, as proud as he is now of Sarah Palin, the fact is that 48 hours before he chose Sarah Palin, I think from eharmony.com or something, I'm not sure where he got her. All right, now I'm in trouble. Before he did that, he was considering Tom Ridge and Joe Lieberman, who are not where Sarah Palin is, on abortion. So you can understand that a pro-life evangelical is a little bit concerned about that. Sarah Palin, let's move off of him then. Basically, I think the way you have to understand McCain, obviously I'm not going to move off of him, let me come back. The way that you need to understand McCain, I think one of the issues in this election we're not talking about very much, is generational. Even though McCain fought in Vietnam, he's from an ethos that arises out of World War II, Korean War. It's John Wayne Christianity. It's do you love Jesus, Pilgrim? It's that kind of not real comfortable talking about your faith, not real comfortable talking about your emotions. Some of you guys have got grandparents, great-grandparents like that. You just can't get them to come out and talk about what really is going on the inside of them. The best example of this I know is when George H.W. Bush, Dad Bush, was asked during his presidential campaign what was he thinking about when he was shot down during World War II and was floating in the Sea of Japan. And George H.W. Bush was terrible at talking about his personal faith. And so he kind of looked off, misty-eyed and said, well, Mom and Dad and our country and God and the separation of church and state. That's what he said. That's what he said. The man's floating in the Sea of Japan during World War II, and he's contemplating the higher meaning of the First Amendment. And everybody thought, that's crap, but it's just the best he can do. He just went to the religious closet, and pulled out everything he could pull out. Not to say he didn't have a sincere faith. I'm talking about the way he presented himself publicly. You understand what I mean. So that's McCain. McCain, asked by Rick Warren, what's your faith? He goes, I'm saved. That's it. I'm done. He spoke the category, and that was it. Obama, different generation, different style, gives us a process answer. You know, well, I trust in Jesus to redeem me of my sins, and I don't walk. He gives a whole, you know, typical of him being kind of an intellectual and of his generation. He's going to tell us, he's going to give us an operational definition and a MapQuest kind of location of how he got there. McCain is sort of, I'm saved, move on, you know, kind of thing. The thing that's going to rise up and hurt Palin that already has is not, I certainly agree with the dean that she's very diverse, and as I've acknowledged already before you, I'm a bit diverse religiously, or at least in terms of my academic background. But that the primary theme in her life has been Pentecostalism, and most Americans can barely distinguish Pentecostalism from snake handling. And so even though that's not a legitimate comparison, obviously, it's actually tarantulas that we handle. And so all that to say that's going to come back and hurt her. And with the advent of YouTube, you can run, but you can't hide. I mean, every time you go to the altar in prayer, every time, you know, somebody lays hands on you, you know, it's not just a private moment between you, God, and your pastor. You know, it now becomes part of the cultural debate. So that's going to hurt her. But we'll see how that plays out. Biden is interesting also, I think, for one of the most important reasons is he's a very sincere Catholic, and he is symbolic of that older politician who can be personally one thing and publicly another. This is a schizophrenia that your generation, if the surveys are correct, has a harder time with. Biden will tell you that he believes that abortion is immoral personally. He believes in the church's teaching on abortion personally. He just simply doesn't believe that he ought to insist on that in the public sphere. Now, that's that older line politician. It's sort of the Howard Dean, you know, Cuomo, I'm personally this, but I won't insist on it. It's the Jimmy Carter style. Your generation, you younger folks, the statistics show that you're impatient with that. You want something consistent from beginning to end. And so it'll be interesting to see how you relate, you know, as the polls unfold and as the debate happens, tomorrow night? It'll be interesting to see how you deal with that. But that Biden is a passionate, mystical Roman Catholic is without question, and given that a good quarter of the electorate is Roman Catholic, it'll be interesting to see how he plays. This is a man who, when he had brain surgery, you know, insisted on putting his rosary underneath his pillow while he was having surgery. So he is a true, you know, theologically conservative or relatively conservative, mystical Roman Catholic. And then of course there's Barack Obama. And Barack Obama is confusing all the lines, and this is a great way to lead us into our Q&A time and our panel discussion, because Barack Obama is, I think, causing us to rethink the way some things are done. I mean, I know that the right tries to pick on him as being the Messiah and the one, you know, all that kind of thing. But he is unique in American politics. And one of the reasons I wrote the book, as a pro-life conservative, I wrote a book on Barack Obama that's not only kind but encouraging about him, is because I think in order to understand our society, you need to understand a guy like Barack Obama, who, if the Pew Forum is correct at all in all of its 20, 30 different surveys on the subject, Barack Obama symbolizes better than almost any other American I can think of on the national scene where America's going. Like it or not, most Americans have a faith, think you ought to have a faith, don't think their faith is the only faith that's true, the only path to God, and think there are many different variations of their faith. That's the majority of America, to about 78 to 85%. Well, that's Barack Obama. So whether I'm talking to a recent class of college graduates, or room full of evangelical pastors, or a bunch of aspiring politicians or lawyers, I say the same thing. You want to understand our society, you need to understand what's happening with Barack Obama. If you don't like it, change it, but this is where we are going. There's no question he is the future, and I don't mean that in a political sense. I don't mean that he's going to ascend to the presidency. That's to be decided. I mean, this is where our society is moving, and moving rapidly. So this election is an absolutely unusual one, and certainly in terms of the lifetimes of anybody in this room. Anybody of age folks in this room, but most importantly because of religion. And from my perspective, I'm glad for that. I don't think religion ought to be something hidden. I think we ought to have dialogue. I think we ought to be learning from each other. I'm saddened by what Americans don't know about world religions. I'm saddened that after 9/11, 2 Sikh Hindus got beaten up on the streets of New York because they thought that those Sikh Hindus were the followers of Osama bin Laden. You can imagine. In fact, in an often undiscussed violent moment, 2 bikers who had good suntans in Texas got beaten up because they were assumed to be the followers of Osama bin Laden just because of the beards. That's how silly we are in our understanding of religion. And I think that religion's coming to bear even more powerfully on politics, and so we ought to be having these conversations. I think it's perfectly legitimate. I'm happy to discuss this and defend this in Q&A, to ask a politician what he believes, how it's going to impact society. I think right now Obama ought to be defending how he's going to sustain faith-based initiatives and who will be his counselors in the Oval Office and how he intends to integrate his left-leaning faith and thus his left-leaning politics into what he does politically. I think it's a perfectly legitimate above-board discussion, and please God, we can stop talking about lipstick and pigs and get down and talk about that kind of stuff. So with that, let's move on to some Q&A and some panel. All right?
All right, thank you, Mr. Beumler and Mr. Mansfield. Okay, we are now going to go into our question and answer session. If you guys have a question, just raise your hand. I'll bring the mic over to you.
This question is Mr. Mansfield. How do you feel about what's your opinion of the Matthew 25 network, and what impact do you think they're going to have on the election?
I was told to go to this mic. Should we stand up each time that we take a question? Pardon? I was, okay, that's fine
Yeah,
with
they're
me.
trying to record
I
it
was told
for
for the internet that we
others,
should
so-
go to the, let me step behind you, excuse me.
Little boy.
By Matthew 25 Network, you're referring to the movement that's come up around Obama? Yeah, as a conservative evangelical who believes that conservative evangelicals have missed the social mandate of Scripture, I'm glad for the religious left to chastise us about that. And many on the right are cynical about any action of faith by Obama or any work like that. I'm not. I think that this has been a glaring omission. The several thousand times that Scripture mentions the poor can't be ignored. You know, I just taught Old Testament survey at a school out in the Carolinas and was again reading these long passages of, you know, imprecation that relate to the poor. You know, there are more dire consequences for messing with the poor and enabling the unrighteous rich than there are for, you know, almost anything else except, you know, I don't know, I won't be cynical about that. Anyway, so I think that's incredibly important. So I tend to hack off my friends on the right because I do take those things seriously. I think it comes from a genuine motif. I think that a motive. I like the folks who are his faith counselors, his faith advisors, 2 or 3 of them. I'm told by Jim Wallace, whom I trust, who's a little further to the left than I am politically, but nevertheless whom I trust as a Christian, that it's extremely sincere and good people are in charge. And so, see, I welcome it. And my response to the right is, if that's bothering you, then get busy. You know, build a better mousetrap, but don't sit around and bellyache about those who are attempting to do something just because you don't agree with them politically. So.
This one's for either of you. As I'm a Christian as well, but one thing that scares me about the way we look at politics and religion is I think we almost make ourselves vulnerable to accept someone who may not be a Christian, but because we want a Christian president or a religious president. I don't know, I'm worried about frauds who may be very deceptive just because we set these standards on our presidents.
Sure. Two quick responses, and then Stephen may have some things to say. One is, that's of course how, you know, the fall of the House of Representatives in the last 4 years, right, is all about people who pretended to be very religious, pious, and moral, who were found out doing other things. So, you know, the Elmer Gantry effect is still alive and well, and you're right to be worried about that. I think there's another thing we ought to be worried about, and that is the true believer who isn't a bad person in terms of his or her moral and religious views. You know, they do everything right, but they're intolerant of others. Because we live in a country whose motto is E pluribus unum, who does have, in addition to these religious and moral values and cultural traditions, a conviction that you can put together a lot of different kinds of people from the very beginning and especially now, and find a stronger, better country. And so I think even though we're talking tonight about testing for religiosity, we got to test for what do you think of other people? Because you're exactly right. The wave, not just of your generation, but maybe the political wave that we're going into is one that doesn't just immediately say everybody's got to be like me in office or I lose.
Just a quick comment about that. I think that forums like this and the encouraging the electorate to get more sophisticated about religion, about faith, will limit the ability of politicians to say I'm a Christian and then live exactly the opposite. Obviously, I was a supporter of George W. Bush, who could say my favorite political philosopher is Jesus, and then go hire Karl Rove, meaner than a junkyard dog. In other words, the more sophisticated we are, the more we understand, the more we press for details and answer and drill down in faith to get down to the meat of what it means, the less we're fobbed off by symbols. The less we just go, well, because a politician ended a speech with God bless America, we're all misty-eyed and we're all moved, he must be a serious man of God. No, that's become, pro forma. So all that to say, I think this kind of thing makes us not more cynical, makes us wiser. And that's what we need is greater wisdom about religion and politics, not a greater cynicism.
My question is for Mr. Mansfield. How do you think that conservative Christians, many of whom, like myself, are African American, how do we begin to talk about a nuanced Christianity that allows us to give voice to all issues of the spectrum, poverty, as well as our views on same-sex marriage, as well as abortion, as well as kind of a liberationist bent? How do we give voice to a nuanced Christianity in kind of a soundbite generation?
I think that's a great question. And I was asked to repeat the questions that I didn't earlier. How do conservatives, particularly African American conservatives, give voice to all the issues that conservatives are concerned about in a soundbite generation in a way that's meaningful? I mean, I know that doesn't do your question justice, but I have long believed that conservatives do themselves a great injustice by their rage, by their anger, by their flame throwing, and have allowed, I don't feel myself on the other side from liberals. I actually feel myself very much moderate and in the middle, and that's not because I'm a coward, it's just because when I come from Scripture, that's where I land. But speaking for conservatives for a moment, yielding to the other side, the compassionate view. I assume you're not a conservative because you hate the poor or disregard the poor. I assume you're not a conservative, because you want to bomb other countries. I assume that you're an economic conservative because you believe it's the greatest way for uplift of all people and economic advancement of all people, and that a socialized state is not. That's how the debate ought to be engaged. I'm not pro-life because I want to remove a woman's prerogatives. I'm pro-life because I believe it's a human being in the womb, and every abortion's the taking of a human life. Now, why can't I express that compassionately? Why can't I come to that issue not as someone who's hateful and raging and shooting abortion doctors and shaming women who are in trouble? Do you understand what I'm saying? But come at it from the standpoint of, help me. I simply believe that's a child. Help me, please. Let's come together. Let's reason. Do you see what I mean? There's a way that we can stop being arrogant and cold and non-compassionate, and instead state our first principles, and then say, help me get there. I don't mean that in some I'm pitiful and I don't know what to do kind of way. I simply mean in a way that shows the compassion of heart. I'm an economic conservative because I think it's best for everybody, not because I want to be a protected white upper middle class of people economically with everybody else paying the burden. I'm ashamed of Wall Street and ashamed of how the free market is. We basically have a mercantilist thing going in D.C. now between Wall Street and D.C. And I think that's a shame and got to stop. But why do I believe that? I'm neither a socialist nor am I an arrogant, oligarch in some way or some kind of plutocrat. I am instead a man who simply believes in limited government and free markets and the government staying the heck out of it. Now talk me out of it if you can. But my point is, what I want to show the world is the fact that I'm not coming from an arrogance or a protective perspective. I'm coming from a desire to do good in society. I'm just coming from a different set of assumptions. Do you see what I mean? And I think conservatives often rage and do the Karl Rove kind of thing rather than saying, look, you don't care any more about the poor than I do. We've just got a different way to go at it. Now let's talk. See, be open to dialogue. And it's because of this merging of religion and politics that baptizes the free market or makes conservatives, especially religious conservatives, believe that whatever they believe fell from heaven, with the Ten Commandments, is what produces that kind of arrogance. You see what I mean? So my response to you, and you have a great opportunity as an African-American conservative, is to come from a perspective of saying, this is not about a protected class, this is not about arrogance, this is not about me trying to protect my prerogatives, and my family prerogatives. This is about me believing these principles are eternally true for all societies, and they do the most good for the most people.
A conservative Christian who supports Barack Obama.
Well, then you are going to hell. There's just no question about it. I mean, you should have told me that. Should have told me that first, then I could have dismissed your question.
So, I mean, kind of throughout the history of African Americans, there's been a strong, I guess, religious bent to our leadership. And I'm curious as to, because now if we have to treat Barack Obama on some level as an African American leader, that kind of leads him to being treated on some level as a religious leader also. Where does he fit in? Where does he fall in? Because there was kind of like this weird, I guess, interaction between him and a lot of civil rights leaders who were men of the church, who were reverends, Jesse Jackson one included. A lot of folks of that era who supported Hillary Clinton, who supported other folks, or who just were staying out of it. And so where does he fall in that tradition? And like, can someone describe the tension of that?
Well, let's say it's generational and it's cultural. It's generational in the sense that some of the civil rights leaders who were very young men, young adults, in Dr. King's time, are now, in their 70s, and are used to thinking about the world and about politics and about power in ways that worked in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s into the 90s. And especially worked during the Clinton administration to try to build a coalition. What's happened, though, with Barack Obama is you have a biracial individual who's chosen to affirm both sides of that in his choice of marriage and in the choice of being connected to his own people, and being kind of out about that and buying into what I believe Randall Kennedy would define as a kind of multiculturalist viewpoint on matters of race and ethnicity over against a race view. And as such, that's going to get worked out by the generation here and successive generations. This is, I guess what I'd say is this is another turn in the page. What's sort of where I thought you were going had to do with how many of the early elected leaders, Walter Fauntroy, Adam Clayton Powell, came right out of the church. Bill Gray were pastors. Floyd Flake, some still in Congress, are pastors on Sunday, and Tuesday through Thursday they're legislative leaders. Obama's coming from the other direction. Maybe part of what went on too is he had success. He's had enormous political success relative to some of the leaders of a prior generation that think, hey, I got all the gifts and the wounds to go with it. So it's a very interesting historical sort of thing. Can that be mended? We've seen some mending now. What happens when Obama is elected and his policies are more conservative in many ways and centrist than the black political community in the northern urban cities is comfortable with. What's the Black Caucus in Congress going to do with an Obama presidency? I think that's stay tuned and have a forum in a year over at Frank's place, right?
This question is for Mr. Mansfield. Growing up as an evangelical liberal, I'm the 13th version. I was curious why most of the evangelical Christians seem to have a lack of interest in environmental issues, since in Genesis, God obviously gives control of the earth to mankind. I was just curious about that.
Because they're idiots. I mean, that's pretty much the short answer. No, I think that the problem has been that a lot of modern evangelicalism is created in reaction to something. And it was an extreme element within the environmentalist movement that evangelicals reacted to, seeing it as a secularistic, pagan, Gaia worship kind of perspective, rather than embracing the positive mandate. It's much like, in my opinion, as much as I'm in favor of Christian schooling, please don't misunderstand, like some of the Christian schools in the South that were founded specifically to react against integration. Now, that's not going to be a strong school if the only thing you're doing is running from blacks and trying to create a white enclave. The same thing is true. Rather than embrace the biblical mandate to care for animals, tend the earth, be wise, etc., see this as something sacred and trusted from God. Again, I would say that because evangelicals have not had that positive vision, they not only reacted to the extremes of the more secular or perhaps indeed neo-pagan environmental movement, but they also were unwilling, I think, to concede those issues, because once the high ground was taken by that more extreme element, you weren't going to have, Jerry Falwell was saying things like, well, I drive my pickup truck and I'll just continue to drive it. Nobody's going to tell me what to drive. And, what would Jesus drive? Well, he would obviously drive an Escalade or two of them at a time, or, whatever, that kind of thing. It just became a weird reactionary ping pong match rather than embracing a biblical mandate and going forward. So I think that's the issue. It's that very few are sitting around thinking positively, what's the positive body of truth we want to represent in the world? Rather, we wait until some crazy gets on Fox, and then we react entirely to the most extreme thing we can find, the most extreme straw man we can find, and therefore excuse ourselves from having to be responsible for the sacred trust of the earth.
My comment is more in the form of a comment, but I'd like for you to respond to it. I'm intrigued by your picking Obama out as someone who is both liberal and taking his faith into the Oval Office and where America is going. But I also hear in so much conversation the discomfort with this black man and an effort to make him a little less black. And this is what I want to say about calling him biracial. I'm always intrigued by that, because Obama is no more biracial than I am. And America can't face that reality. I have green eyes, and they did not come from my Yoruba grandfather. They came from a white man. In other words, there is an integration between black folk and white folk that is historical in this country. And Obama had the way he looks, he certainly could not have walked around and identified only with his white mother. He has to identify with his black father. And I know that there's an undercurrent. This forum was billed as race, religion, and politics. There are people out there that some of us fear will not vote for him because they cannot bring themselves, no matter what he says, no matter what his faith, to vote for a man with dark skin. That is still a problem in this country. What is also intriguing about Obama is that being what you described, Mr. Mansfield, I came in late, I think you're Mansfield, how you described him comes straight out of African-American history. He is not the first leader. He's the first one white folks have paid attention to. But he is certainly not the first leader that has had deep faith and a commitment to progressive ideals. Many of our intellectuals, like W.B. Du Bois, I've written a piece about his religious experience right here in Tennessee when he was a teacher right here at Fisk University before he went to Harvard, followed in similar footsteps as Barack Obama. You can find this in Frederick Douglass. You can find, and I'm also interested, I find intriguing what you say about the new evangelicals. I was sitting back there remembering my history and thinking about the Great Awakening and how so many who became involved in the abolitionist movement came out of a religious movement in the early part of our country's history. So it seems to me that there's so much what we don't want to talk about in terms of the Obama phenomenon and what that means for the future. And finally, the question about the relationship with the older generation. I think everything that you said is correct, but I think there's also more. And the more is the failure of other leaders to get the attention of this country in a broader sense. Martin Luther King certainly spoke to the world's poor. He didn't speak just to African Americans, but he spoke about, in fact, he was killed on a Poor People's March. So some of that has to do with the egos and the personalities, and if you notice, most of those people who are having problems are men. You know, there are problems with men we need to talk about. But because the women don't have a problem, you know, with Barack Obama. Even the ones who supported Hillary support Barack Obama. And so I think that there's still much that we will continue to talk about in terms of this mama as we watch what happens in the next 3 weeks.
Would you like a little bit of a response, or?
Well, that one.
I want to say thank you for bringing up the fact that I do think the unknown factor, you know, in all of the polling and everything that goes with it is who's saying they're going to vote for Obama and won't, because they see the world in a very racialized lens. The comment I would make in terms of having introduced the concept of biracial and multiracial alongside racial is part of, remember, race is a social construct that has operated as potently as you described it throughout our history. What if there are other constructs that Obama seems to be introducing as a conflicting or supplementary sort of thing? We just don't know how that's going to play out because we've spent 400 plus years working on one social construct, which, while powerful, is not the only conceivable or operable one. Here's a guy who's running on a politics of new politics and hope when everything that we've been told for the last 25 years is going negative works. I just don't know how it's going to work, and I don't know, you know, that's the big unknown alongside the race thing. I will say this, if he loses, it's the last hope candidate we'll see in a long time.
One more or two more questions, and then we'll make some announcements.
I just wondered what you both think about the tension that we're experiencing between the complexity of our choice, as you have brought out more clearly in some of the comments and questions had, that this election, more than any in the recent past certainly, is very complicated with this whole mix of gender and race and what's happening economically and everything. And at the same time, our culture in general is more dependent or more attuned to what somebody else said, you know, the sound bites, the YouTube little snippet of somebody saying something stupid. And what is your gut feeling about the intelligence of the average American voter? Or what do you think that people are really going to wrestle with, that most people are really going to wrestle with this any differently than they have in past elections?
Dean, let me make the mess, and then you can clean it up, all right?
All yours.
I'm going to make a mess, and then he can clean it up. I'm of the opinion that this is going to be a great kind of air-clearing kind of election. in the sense that some of the stuff we thought would be real important will burn out and not end up being. For example, we finally have a viable female candidate. I know we've had another one for the vice presidency. For many women, it doesn't matter that she's female. They just believe she's unqualified. Do you understand what I'm saying? The fact that she's female, now that she's there, it's like, you know. I can open up a can of worms by saying we have now our first viable black presidential candidate. And for many people, it doesn't matter. There is that racist slice of the electorate, but they're so far to the right that they're in that hard-fixed Republican camp, just like they're focused on the hard-fixed Democrat camp. And you guys all are politically sophisticated enough to know that it's a middle 12 to 15% slice that determine every election in America. It's the Reagan Democrats, it's that middle crowd. It's not racist, it's not Bubba's in South Alabama wearing sheets. It's not that kind of crowd. So, sorry, I didn't mean to quite go there. A little bit of academic Tourette's. So all that to say that what I think is going to happen here is we're going to say it didn't end up mattering that much. I certainly care, obviously, about a woman being eventually in the Oval Office. I care about a black man being there. I'm just saying that now that it's there, people are making decisions on some other basis for the most part. And so we're glad a woman can be. We're glad for Hillary. We're glad for Sarah Palin. We're glad that they can come to that level. Now let's get down to what they believe and what competence they have and who's going to do a good job. Male, female. Most angry people I know about Sarah Palin are women. You know? Right? Am I wrong? Come on, you know. And that's not a catty thing, you know, a beauty shop thing in that kind of sexist way we talk about it on TV. No, that's just, okay, she's a woman, big deal. She doesn't know anything, so I don't want to vote for her. You know, that kind of attitude. Or she's great, she's brilliant. Look what she does. You know, she can cook with her left foot, you know, and tend to her children with her right hand and run the state of Alaska with her other hand. And so that, she can and kill a moose with her bare hand. I mean, this is, you know, whatever. But the point is, we don't care that she's female. And I think that's what this election might do, is move us into a post those kind of concerns mode. I know the scholars and the political scientists will be debating this for years, but at a practical level, I think what's going to happen is that this election is going to clear the decks, and next time it's not going to matter as much. We'll still be happy because it shows onward progress on all those fronts, but after they're up and we go, another woman, this is great. Now, does she know anything? Does she have any competence? Does he know anything? Is he an idiot? Does he just fall off the pumpkin truck last week? That kind of thing. Okay, now that I've made the mess, I'll pass to the dean.
No wisdom, just signposts on the way. First was as late as August, there was something like 49% of Americans polled by Pew thought Barack Obama was Muslim. Okay, he's been out there for all this time and he's still Muslim. On the other hand, during the week of the Democratic convention, we had the highest numbers ever to watch a political convention. And here's the third. And it wasn't just celebrity, because the next week we had those same numbers. Maybe we're smarter than we poll. I don't know. I hope so, and I'll go home and add that to my prayers tonight.
You talked a lot about a new era where religion was being brought into the Oval Office, and you also talked about problems with the religious right failing to cooperate, I guess, or see ways that the two sides could cooperate. And I'm wondering what your opinion is about whether it's a good thing that religion is now being brought, on both sides. Do you see that as a good thing, or do you see that as something standing in the way of making rational or focusing on what the morals that come out of a person's? For example, I'm pro-choice, and if somebody brings up a religious argument against abortion, I'm going to discard it. But if they bring up a rational argument and say, well, I believe that's a human being,
Right.
I'm much more likely to say, well, you have a point here, let's talk about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, we haven't been doing a very good job. I certainly haven't, of repeating the question. The bottom line is the presence of religion in politics and in a candidate's mind a good thing, or is it impeding progress? That's kind of boiling down the question. I'm an advocate for the idea that faith, that we don't even have to debate whether faith ought to be present in amongst our leaders. It just is, and it's a factor. I can leave it there. I'm sure there are surveys and studies and analyses, and obviously those who prefer a more strongly separationist model in terms of the First Amendment are obviously going to be nervous about this. My contention is not that it ought to be. My contention is that it is there. Religion is a factor. And don't we wish we'd understood some people more? Don't we wish that we'd known more of what George W. Bush actually believed, rather than just, I'm speaking to evangelicals now, saying, isn't it great that Jesus is his favorite political philosopher? I mean, the theory is that that was the only philosopher he'd ever read. So you know, I mean, my point is that that didn't tell us anything. It was a symbolic balloon or a flag just thrown up and people saluted. So I'm of the opinion, I just give you my opinion, I'm of the opinion that it's a good thing ultimately. What we have going on right now in Wall Street is not too much religion, but too little. What we have is not too much morality, it's too little. We all believe that we don't want a merging between church and state, obviously. We don't want a theocracy, obviously. Nobody wants that. But as I wrote in the book, and I'm almost quoting here, when a man's or a woman's faith is sincere, it's among the most important things about them. And it does tell you a great deal about who they are. And so that's why I write the books that I do. If Bill Clinton has a certain worldview, if he's a sincere Baptist Christian, that's going to shape who he is politically. Everybody's going to be shaped by that. The guys we ought to be a little concerned about and watch carefully are the guys whose worldviews are somewhat unformed. Again, Reagan, whom we all admire, I think, especially with distance, but nevertheless, who got scary, there with the finger on the nuclear button, and he's contemplating whether Armageddon wouldn't be a great solution to Middle East politics. I'm putting that humorously, but you understand my point.
Wasn't too good on the poor either.
Wasn't too good on the poor either, yeah. So, but you understand my point, that kind of, what's he reading recently? Please God, make sure he reads the right books. You know what I'm saying? So we don't have a massive turn in policy. So I think that it's a good thing. I think it makes better people. I think it makes more noble people, because I happen to believe that there is a God. I happen to believe he does actually work in the lives of people. And I happen to believe that religion is a positive force for good for the most part in world history. In terms of American-style religion, and I think that's a legitimate phrase to use, I think when it's sincere, it can be a powerful force. I think it's the cynical misuse of it. I think it's our ignorance about it, and I think it's the political manipulation of it that has been the biggest negative. But I and about 85% of the American people, according to most surveys, want somebody who has a faith orientation that guarantees basic morality. And I think that those of us who are in institutions like this have an obligation to understand and articulate that in such a way that that becomes more than just pious mush in a political campaign. Okay? Oh, are we done? Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you have anything else?
No. Except to say thank you for all these people to listen to us and to yourselves for an hour and a half.
I think we were really honored this evening to have these two guests with us, and we really do thank you very much for the great discussion and the great perspectives at a very timely moment in our history. I do want to tell you that we have all of the books that were mentioned here tonight for sale right outside. You can have them autographed if you wish. We also are going to be downstairs for dinner, and you can continue conversation and question and dialogue with both of our speakers tonight in the Commons for dinner. The last thing that I would like to say before we give them another round of applause is that it is really an honor to be a faculty member in the Commons. This is a Commons-sponsored event. It's an honor to work with other colleagues, Mark Dalhouse, Frank Dobson, and to have Dr. Paul Lim, who really led this initiative to bring these speakers here. All of us come from different schools in the university as faculty heads of house. And so to learn about each other and the work that we do, and to have this kind of academic presentation, intellectual dialogue
with each other is one of the uncommon things in the commons. And it's becoming more common to have these for among our freshmen especially. But we are so pleased to have all of the students here tonight to interact. We're really glad that first-time voters have come to the table tonight to listen, to be informed, and to continue to do this through other activities here in the Commons and elsewhere in the university. I would like to invite all of you on election night. The Commons is going to be turned into Election Central, and we are going to be here until a president is elected. So we would love to invite all of you to the Commons on that evening to be here with one another and to see the things that happen that evening and who does become the president of our country. Again, I would like to have us give a great round of applause to the room and the students.
I just wanted to make the announcement that in several houses tomorrow, we'll be watching the debate. It won't be in my house this time, but in the house, students are invited to watch the debate. Then in my house, in East House, and other houses, Denball House and others, will be watching the debate. And in Surratt Cinema, there will be, for the Belmont debate, there will be screens up for students to see. So there'll be a lot of places on campus for students to watch the debate. So you might want to take advantage of that opportunity. And of course, there'll be discussion in many of the houses and in the Surratt Cinema and other places as well.
Thank you again, and join us downstairs for dinner and conversation.